He was kneeling on the concrete floor of an auction house lobby that probably cost more to tile than his entire garage was worth, retying his son's shoelace, when the first person decided he didn't belong there. The second person decided it about 4 seconds later. And the third, a tall man in a charcoal suit, who appeared from behind a partition like he'd been summoned by the smell of engine oil, decided it loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. But none of them knew who they were looking at. That was the thing about Theo Raines. He had spent the last 3.5 years making absolutely sure that nobody would. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story reaches. The morning had started the way most of Theo's mornings started, which was with a small foot in his kidney and the sound of a 5-year-old breathing like he owned the entire bed. Miles slept diagonally. He slept violently. He slept with the absolute physical commitment of a child who had not yet learned that beds had edges. And he had migrated from his own room to Theo's sometime around 2 in the morning through a process that Theo had never once successfully detected in progress. He just woke up, and the kid was there, sideways, one arm flung across Theo's face, the other clutching a red metal lunchbox that contained 3 toy wrenches, a plastic caliper, and a single crayon that had been in there so long it had melted slightly against the inner wall. Miles called the lunchbox his field kit. Theo lay there for a minute, listening to his son breathe and staring at the ceiling. The ceiling had a crack in it shaped like a river delta that he'd been meaning to fix since February. It was October. The crack was winning. He got up without waking Miles, which required the slow tactical extraction of someone diffusing ordnance, and went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker. The coffee maker was loud and old and had been Beth's. Most things in the house had been Beth's once. He kept them the way you kept the things that belonged to someone who wasn't coming back, not as shrines, just as things that still worked and still smelled faintly of the person who'd chosen them. He stood at the window. The yard needed everything. Mowing, edging, the fence along the back had a lean to it that was gradually becoming architectural. There was a brake drum sitting on the porch steps that Miles had carried home from somewhere 3 weeks ago and declared a project. Theo hadn't moved it because the kid had plans for it, apparently, and the plans were not yet complete. Theo Raines was 34. He was 6 feet tall with the kind of lean that came from work, not exercise, dark hair that needed cutting, and hands that carried permanent stain lines along the knuckles no matter what he scrubbed with. He had a quiet face. People sometimes called it serious. People who knew him better called it careful, like he was always measuring something before he committed to it, which was more or less true, because that was how engineers thought, and Theo had never fully stopped being one, no matter how hard he'd tried. He ran a repair shop called Raines Mechanical on the south end of town, in a building that used to be a feed store. 3 bays, decent lifts, a parts room that smelled like brake fluid and old rubber. He had 2 people working for him. Frank Kovich, who was 56 and had been rebuilding transmissions since before Theo was born, and Zara Okonkwo, who was 27 and had a degree in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech that she was currently not using while she figured out her life. She'd been figuring it out for about 1.5 years. Theo didn't push. He understood the feeling. The shop did honest work. Fleet contracts, brake jobs, the occasional classic restoration that found its way to him through word of mouth. He charged fair and he didn't cut corners and his customers came back. Simple. Nobody who brought their car to Raines Mechanical knew, and Theo had gone to great lengths to keep it that way, that the man handing back their keys with grease on his shirt had, until 3.5 years ago, been the lead powertrain engineer on 2 Le Mans campaigns. That he held 6 patents on turbocharger thermal management systems currently licensed by manufacturers in 3 countries, that he'd co-founded a firm called Meridian Propulsion Technologies that had been acquired for $340 million when he was 29, a deal that closed while he was still moving through the world like a man underwater. 8 months after Beth's funeral, while lawyers handled the details because Theo couldn't sit in a conference room without looking out the window and forgetting what room he was in. He didn't need to work again. Financially, not ever. He chose to because the alternative was stillness, and stillness felt too much like the thing he was trying to move through. He got Miles up at 7. The process involved strategic deployment of toast smell, the opening of curtains in a specific sequence, and the patient acceptance that a 5-year-old would emerge from his room in his own time and not a second before. Miles appeared at 7:12 with his hair going in 3 directions and the field kit tucked under his arm. "What's for breakfast?" "Oatmeal." Miles considered this the way he considered most things, with a gravity that belonged to someone much older. "With the brown sugar?" "Yes." "Okay." They ate. Miles drew in the notebook he kept at the table, the one full of engine cross-sections and suspension diagrams rendered in the unsteady but surprisingly accurate hand of a kid who watched everything his father did and understood more of it than any 5-year-old should. There was a drawing on the fridge that Theo was privately proud of. Miles's version of a turbocharger, all swooping arrows and enthusiastic circles, with a stick figure labeled Dad standing next to it. Theo needed to pick up a set of headers for a restoration project. The only place that had them locally was Carlisle and Associates, the high-end automotive auction and consignment house on the north side of town. It was the kind of place that dealt in cars worth more than houses, the kind of place with stone floors and track lighting and staff, who spoke in the modulated tones of people trained to make expensive things feel inevitable. He loaded Miles into the truck, a 12-year-old Silverado that ran perfectly because Theo maintained it himself. Miles brought the field kit without asking, "Where are we going?" "Parts pickup, the fancy place, the auction house." "Yeah." Miles pressed his nose to the window. "Why is it fancy if it's just cars?" "Because the cars cost more than most things." "That's dumb." "Maybe." "Cars should cost what they're worth inside," Miles said, which was such a strange and unexpectedly precise thing for a 5-year-old to say that Theo looked at him in the rear view for a moment before responding. "Yeah," he said, "they should." Carlisle and Associates was objectively impressive. Glass and reclaimed timber, the architecture of a building that wanted you to know the things inside it mattered. Through the front windows, you could see the inventory, a row of European exotics and pre-war Americans arranged under lighting that had been calibrated to make paint depths glow. They went inside. The temperature was cooler than it needed to be. The air had a faint scent of leather and something woody. Miles held Theo's hand and looked around with the systematic attention he gave to all new mechanical environments. Theo found the consignment office at the rear, gave the woman at the counter his name and order number. She typed. He waited. Miles stood beside him, field kit in hand, studying a large framed photograph on the wall, a cutaway illustration of a flat-six engine, the kind of technical art that showed every component in cross-section. "That's the oil cooler," Miles said quietly. Theo looked. "Yeah, it's drawn wrong. The feed line goes to the wrong side." Theo looked more carefully. The kid was right. The illustration had the oil cooler feed routed incorrectly, the kind of error that wouldn't matter to anyone looking at wall art, but was technically inaccurate. "Good catch," Theo said. Miles nodded, satisfied, and went back to examining the picture. The problem arrived in the form of footsteps, sharp, deliberate, expensive shoes on stone. "Excuse me." Theo turned. The man was mid-40s, groomed in the way that cost real money. Hair too precise, tan too maintained for October. His name tag read Preston Yates, Director of Client Relations. He was looking at Theo and Miles with an expression Theo recognized immediately. The specific contempt that didn't bother disguising itself because it didn't see the point. "Can I help you?" Yates said, in the way that meant the opposite. "Picking up parts. Already handled." Yates's gaze traveled from Theo's face to his clothes. The worn Carhartt jacket, the work boots, the jeans with a faded oil stain on the left knee, then down to Miles. Small, quiet, holding his red lunchbox with both hands. "This is a consignment gallery," Yates said. "We maintain a certain atmosphere for our clients." "I'm at the parts counter," Theo said. "I understand that. But our space speaks to a particular standard of," and the pause was doing all the work, presentation. The woman at the counter had gone very still. Theo felt it start. The slow heat that began in his chest and moved upward. He knew this feeling. He knew what came after it. He knew that what you did in the 30 seconds after the heat arrived was what your son would remember. He looked at Miles. Miles was watching him. Not scared. The kid didn't scare easily, but watching, with those dark, serious eyes, waiting to see what his father would do. "Parts ready?" Theo asked the counter woman. She produced a box without looking up. "Yes, sir." He picked it up. "Come on, bud." But Miles started. "I know." They walked out. Through the gallery, past the lit cars, past the stone and timber, into the October morning. Miles was quiet until they reached the truck. Then, why didn't you say anything back? Theo got him buckled, walked around, got in, sat there. Sometimes, he said, the smartest thing you can say is nothing. He was mean. Yeah. He looked at me like I was dirt. And that was what sat in Theo's chest for the rest of the drive. Not his own humiliation. He'd been underestimated his whole life and had mostly stopped caring. But Miles catching the exact moment a grown man dismissed him, processing it behind those quiet eyes. That part stayed. At the shop, Frank had the radio on and a Buick up on the lift. Zara arrived at 8:30 with coffee from the diner and her usual energy and spotted Miles at his corner table, the folding table Frank had set up for him months ago, and said, "Hey, little mechanic." Miles held up a toy wrench in greeting. Around 11, Zara found Theo under a truck and sat down on a creeper. Miles told me what happened. Of course he did. Some guy at the auction house? Client relations director? Theo rolled out. It doesn't matter. It matters to your kid. I asked him what he thought, and he said, she paused. He said you didn't yell because you were smarter than the man, and yelling is what dumb people do. Theo stared at the undercarriage. Kid's got you figured out, Zara said. He's got me completely figured out. You still should have said something. Probably, Theo agreed, and rolled back under. That evening, after pasta and half a nature documentary that Miles declared too loud and also sad, after the kid fell asleep on the couch with the field kit beside him, Theo carried him to bed and stood in the doorway of the small room. The rocket nightlight, the drawings on the walls, the toy cars arranged on the windowsill in an order only Miles understood. He thought about Beth. Not the sharp way anymore, the way that had dominated the first year. The way you thought about weather that had shaped the landscape even after it passed. She would have said something to Yates. Something precise and devastating and quiet. She'd had that ability. He sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and did the shop's numbers. The phone was silent. It was usually silent. He'd spent 3 years shrinking the circle of people who had this number. And 20 minutes across town, in a glass-walled office above a gallery of million-dollar machines, a woman Theo Raines had never spoken to was staring at a diagnostic file that was about to bring their lives into collision. Ingrid Carlisle had not slept properly in 5 days. She'd built her business on controlled sleep deprivation, the particular fuel of someone who had too much riding on every decision to afford the luxury of rest. But this was different. This was the sleeplessness of a problem that would not yield to preparation or money or will. She was standing in the climate-controlled vault beneath the auction house at 6 in the morning, holding coffee that had gone cold, staring at a 1961 Maserati 3500 GT Vignale Spider, one of 32 ever built, numbers matching, original Tipo 101 inline 6. It belonged to Arthur Langford, industrialist, collector, and the single most important private client her business had ever cultivated. The Langford Heritage Concours was 11 days away. This car was to be the centerpiece. Running, drivable, demonstrated. It was none of those things. The engine turned, caught almost, and died. Every time. No codes, no visible damage. 3 specialists over 9 days. The last one had charged $6,000 and produced a 20-page report that concluded the fault was beyond current diagnostic capability. Ingrid had read everything. She'd gone deep into forum archives, technical papers, digitized workshop manuals from the early 60s, and on the 4th page of an obscure engineering forum, she'd found a thread from 7 years ago. A detailed description of an intermittent fault in period Italian inline-6 engines with Weber carburetors under modern fuel conditions. The post described a diagnostic method that matched her car's behavior precisely. The name at the bottom was Theo Raines. She searched him. The results assembled a picture that made her sit very still. Le Mans campaigns, patents, Meridian propulsion technologies, the acquisition, and then, almost accidentally, a local business listing. Raines Mechanical, south end of town. She pulled the parts counter records, cross-referenced today's date, and then she went downstairs and spoke to the counterwoman and learned what Preston Yates had done in her building that morning to a man and his child. She made 2 calls. The first was to HR. The second was to Raines Mechanical. A young woman answered. Raines Mechanical, this is Zara. I need to speak with Theo Raines. My name is Ingrid Carlisle. A pause. Hold music. 2 minutes. This is Theo, Mr. Raines. I'm calling about 2 things. First, to apologize for what happened at my auction house this morning. What you and your son experienced was unacceptable, and I'm sorry. Silence. Okay, Theo said. Second, I have a 1961 Maserati 3500 GT with an intermittent no-start condition that 3 specialists have failed to diagnose. I found a forum post you wrote 7 years ago describing the exact fault behavior. I have 11 days before this car needs to be running at a private concours. Another silence. Different quality. That post is old, he said. The problem is older. She could hear the garage around him. Metal. Air tools. A child's voice asking something in the background. I'm not consulting, he said. I'm asking for an exception. Come look at it. If it's beyond what you're willing to take on, walk away. A long pause. Tomorrow evening. After 6. After my kids. Settled. No promises. I'll be there. He hung up. She drove to the auction house the next evening and found him at the side entrance at 6:12. She'd taken him in through the service wing, bypassing the gallery entirely. Deliberate. The vault was controlled, quiet. The Maserati sat under soft light, its Vignale coachwork dark blue, the chrome understated, the proportions of something that had been shaped by hands that understood beauty as a form of engineering. Theo stood at the entrance and just looked at it. He didn't move for 10 seconds. Then he walked slowly around it, crouched at the front quarter, stood, moved to the driver's side. Can I open the hood? Whatever you need. The inline 6 sat there under the hood. The Weber carburetors, triple setup, the original intake manifold. He leaned in, ran his phone light along the underside of the manifold, checked the fuel rail connections, studied the distributor. He was quiet for 3 minutes. Start it, he said. She sat in the driver's seat. The engine turned, caught, died. Again. Same result. One more. Hold the key for 2 full seconds at the catch point. She did. The engine almost held. Released. Theo straightened up. I know what it is. Ingrid was out of the car before he finished the sentence. It's a fuel atomization issue in the intake runners. These Webers with the original manifold casting on modern pump fuel, the ethanol content changes the vapor pressure behavior in the float bowls. It creates intermittent vapor lock in a specific thermal window. Too cold, it starts fine. Too hot, it's past the problem range. But in this ambient temperature, after sitting in this vault at this humidity, it hits the condition every time. She stared at him. 3 specialists couldn't find that. They ran modern diagnostic on a pre-modern problem. This fault doesn't produce codes. It doesn't leave evidence. You have to know it exists to find it. Silence in the vault. A car ticked somewhere. Can you fix it? The Webers need to come off. I need to examine the accelerator pump circuits, resize the main jets, recalibrate the float levels for modern fuel density. The ignition timing needs adjustment, small but specific, and there's a component at the manifold-to-head interface that I'll need to either source or fabricate. How long? 3 sessions. I can't start it and leave it in pieces. If I commit, I need to finish. Name your terms, my tools, my process. Nobody touches the car while I'm working. Access at whatever hours work around my kid's schedule, and full documentation of everything the other 3 did. Done. I prepped notes tonight. He looked at her. She'd prepped notes before he'd agreed. He registered that. What happened to the man from yesterday? He said. Something crossed her face. Administrative leave. Pending formal review. I didn't ask for that. I know. I did it because it was the right thing to do in my building. He came back Thursday evening and Friday. The work was precise, unhurried, the particular state of focused calm that only genuine expertise produced. He explained as he went. She asked questions that followed from what he'd said, not filler, real questions. He rebuilt the carburetors on his kitchen table, Thursday night after Miles was asleep, each circuit methodical, each jet measured against the recalculated spec. He fabricated an interface adapter on the lathe at his shop. Friday afternoon, an aluminum piece requiring tolerances that the equipment could achieve if he was patient and exact. Friday night, 11:40. Everything installed. Timing recalibrated. Start it, he said. She turned the key. The engine caught, held. The idle settled. Rough at first, then smooth. The inline 6 finding its voice, the Webers breathing correctly. The exhaust note from the side pipes carrying the specific character of a Tipo 101 in health. A sound that had not existed in this vault for however long the car had been broken. Theo stood at the front and listened. He listened for the hesitation. It was gone. It's running, Ingrid said from the driver's seat. Her hands were on the wheel without her having decided to put them there. It's running. You did this in 3 evenings. I knew where to look. That's the only difference. She cut the engine. The silence was significant. They stood on opposite sides of the car, and neither spoke for a moment because the silence felt like it deserved not to be filled. He came back Saturday for confirmation. Same behavior. Consistent start. Clean idle. The solution held. She named the fee Marcus, her operations manager, had proposed. It was more than the 3 specialists combined. That's disproportionate, Theo said. It's accurate. There's a difference. Date half. STEM programs, trade school scholarships, I don't care. Something that matters. She looked at him. I'll send you where it goes. I want to know. The Langford Heritage Concours was held on a Tuesday evening at Langford's estate east of town. Stone and timber, old trees, the kind of property that didn't announce itself from the road. 24 vehicles displayed across a converted carriage house and the front courtyard. The Maserati sat at the center of the indoor collection, dark blue under amber light, present in the way that a machine was present when it had been through something and come out the other side. Arthur Langford was 71, compact, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who'd been active his whole life and the handshake of someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything with it. Theo Raines, he said. Ingrid tells me you solved what 3 others couldn't. I knew what to look for. How? I read the right technical journals when I was younger, and I remembered them. Langford studied him, then looked down at Miles, who was standing at Theo's side in his good sweater, holding the field kit. And who are you? Miles Raines. May I have a closer look at the car? Langford blinked, looked at Theo. Theo made no expression. You may, Langford said. They walked to the car together, the 71-year-old collector and the 5-year-old with the red lunchbox. Miles stood at the window and looked in with both hands framing his face against the glass. The coachwork is Vignale, Miles said. It is, Langford said, and his voice changed. The engine is a Tipo 101 inline 6. There were 32 Spiders made. My dad fixed the carburetors, and the timing and the manifold interface. He made a part on the lathe. Langford looked across the roof at Theo. Would you like to hear it run? Langford asked Miles. Miles looked at his father, read the answer, turned back. Yes, please. Ingrid sat in the driver's seat. The engine caught, held, breathed. The inline 6 filling the carriage house with a sound that several nearby guests turned to hear. The idle even and clean, the Webers doing what they were designed to do under conditions they were finally calibrated for. Miles stood with his hands at his sides and listened with his whole body. Langford stood beside him and did the same thing. Ingrid cut the engine at Langford's nod. The silence had the quality of something completed. Later, walking to the truck, Ingrid beside them, Miles 3 steps ahead with the field kit swinging. I'm going to call you next week, she said. Not about cars, or not only about cars. He looked at her. Coffee, she said. Or whatever 2 people have when they're both better at their work than they are at this. I don't do things quickly, he said. I'm not asking for quickly. I'm asking for coffee. Okay. He drove home through empty October streets, with Miles asleep in the back seat, the field kit in his lap, breathing slow and completely unworried. He thought about the week. The auction house, Yates, the decision he'd made in 30 seconds while his son watched. The call he'd almost not taken. 3 evenings in a vault with a machine that remembered what it was supposed to sound like, once someone reminded it. He thought about what Miles had said in the truck that first morning. Cars should cost what they're worth inside. He thought about people the same way. The ones who looked at a man in a worn jacket and saw nothing worth seeing. The ones who looked and saw everything. He carried Miles inside. The rocket nightlight was on. The drawings were on the walls. The field kit went on the pillow. He stood in the doorway and looked at his sleeping son and thought about what you carried forward and what you let go and how the things you learned never actually left, even when you stepped away from everything else. They just waited quietly. For the moment, someone needed exactly that and nothing else. The morning would come. It always did. And there was work in it worth doing, and people in it worth knowing, and a 5-year-old who would wake up and ask questions that deserved real answers, and carry a red lunchbox to breakfast, and draw engines with the confident, shaky hand of someone who was only beginning to understand how much there was to understand. The morning would come, and this time, Theo Raines was ready for it.